Chapter 9. The California Discovery of 1848. 1. James Marshall and the Incident at Sutter's Mill. The transformation of the world's monetary destiny did not begin with a grand proclamation, but with a singular crystalline moment of clarity in the rugged isolation of the Sierra Nevada foothills. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, the air at Sutter's Mill was biting and sharp, scented with the resinous tang of freshly sawn yellow pine and the cold mineral breath of the American River. James Wilson Marshall, a man of quiet temperament and observant eyes, was conducting a routine inspection of the tailrace, the narrow channel designed to carry wastewater away from the newly constructed sawmill. The river, swollen with winter rains and snowmelt, rushed with a violent, frothy energy through the wooden flume, scouring the earth down to its ancient stony ribs. As the morning sun crested the timberline, casting long, jagged shadows across the water, Marshall's eye was snagged by a defiant glimmer, resting in the shallow sediment. It was a hue that did not belong to the dull grays of granite or the muddy browns of the river silt. He waded into the numbing icy current, his boots crunching against the bedrock, and reached into the swirling water. Between his calloused thumb and forefinger he retrieved a heavy metallic flake, a jagged piece of sun-bright stone no larger than a grain of wheat, yet possessed of a weight that seemed to defy its size. Marshall's reaction was not of immediate jubilation, but of profound, unsettling curiosity. He sat upon a nearby timber, the flake resting in his palm, reflecting the harsh California sky. He struck the metal against a rock. It did not shatter like iron pyrites or fool's gold, but instead yielded with a soft, buttery malleability, flattening into a thin leaf. This was the primary characteristic of high-purity 23-karat gold, preserved for eons in the quartz veins of the mountains and washed down by millennia of erosion. In that silent, solitary moment, the pastoral dream of the Sacramento Valley, a world of cattle, wheat, and quiet frontier life, was effectively annihilated. When Marshall rode to Sutter's Fort to present the find to his employer, the Swiss pioneer John Sutter, the atmosphere was one of hushed, conspiratorial dread. Behind the heavy oak doors of Sutter's private parlor, the two men subjected the metal to the ordeal of fire and acid. They consulted a battered copy of the Encyclopedia Americana, performed primitive gravity tests, and watched as the substance remained imperiously unaffected by nitric acid. Sutter, peering through his spectacles at the glowing grains, famously remarked that his heart was heavy with a premonition of disaster. He looked at the gold and did not see wealth. He saw the human locusts that would soon swarm his lands, the desertion of his laborers, and the end of his quiet empire. Marshall, the accidental midwife of the modern world, had reached into the mud and pulled out the shimmering fuse that would ignite the greatest mass migration in human history. 2. The struggle for secrecy and the inevitable news leak. In the days following the discovery, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon Sutter's Mill. John Sutter, possessing the foresight of a man who had built an empire from nothing, understood that gold was a jealous god that would demand the sacrifice of everything he held dear. Behind the heavy reinforced walls of his fort, he made his men swear a solemn, ironclad oath of secrecy. He pleaded with them to finish the construction of the mill, promising them a share of the wealth once the harvest was in. For a few fragile weeks, the secret remained locked within the dark timber of the Sierra Nevada. But the very earth seemed to vibrate with the presence of the hidden treasure. However, secrecy in a frontier wilderness is an impossible ambition. The golden secret began to bleed out through the mundane transactions of daily life. It started with the whispering dust, small buckskin pouches of yellow flakes exchanged for bottles of rot-gut brandy at the local stores. A teamster, his eyes wild with a strange new light, would pay for a meal with a nugget instead of a silver coin. The laborers at the mill, unable to contain the electric thrill of their find, wrote letters to their families in the East. Letters that once opened acted as a contagion. The air in the Sacramento Valley grew thick with a mounting, unspoken tension as the pastoral rhythm of the New Helvetia was slowly poisoned by the intoxicating scent of easy wealth. The definitive rupture occurred not through a whisper, but through a calculated shout. Samuel Brannan, a shrewd and opportunistic merchant who recognized that the true profit lay not in digging gold, but in supplying the diggers, decided to shatter the silence for his own gain. In May 1848, Brannan stood in the dusty, wind-swept streets of San Francisco. In his hand, he flourished a glass vial filled with coarse, shimmering gold dust that caught the afternoon light like a miniature sun. His voice, booming with theatrical fervor, echoed across the plaza. "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" With those 6 words, the dam of secrecy burst with catastrophic force. The news didn't just travel, it erupted. It bypassed the slow formal channels of government reports and military dispatches, leaping from person to person like a brush fire in a dry canyon. Brannan's shout was the herald of a new age, a clarion call that announced the death of the old agrarian California. The secret was no longer a burden for Sutter and Marshall to carry. It was now a global phenomenon, a shimmering fever that was already beginning to draw the eyes of the world towards the once obscure banks of the American River. The age of innocence was over. The age of the rush had begun. 3. The deserted city. San Francisco's reaction to the find. Following Samuel Brannan's theatrical proclamation, San Francisco, then a burgeoning maritime outpost known as Yerba Buena, did not merely react, it underwent a total, feverish evaporation. The news of gold acted as a magnetic pulse that stripped the city of its human bloodlight. By June 1848, the bustling sounds of hammers, the cries of street vendors, and the low hum of civic life were replaced by an eerie, hollow silence. San Francisco became a ghost city in reverse, not destroyed by war or pestilence, but hollowed out by the promise of a different kind of life. It was as if a great spirit had whispered a command that no soul possessed the strength to ignore. The scenes of abandonment were surreal, bordering on the apocalyptic. Houses were left with their doors swinging on hinges. Laundry remained frozen on lines, whipping in the Pacific breeze, and half-eaten meals grew cold on tavern tables. The local newspaper, The Californian, published its final, frantic edition with a single, desperate headline. The whole country, from San Francisco to Los Angeles, resounds with the sordid cry of gold, gold, gold. Before the ink was even dry, the editor, the typesetters, and the delivery boys had vanished into the hills, leaving the press silent for the first time in its history. Shops were left wide open, their owners having scribbled hurried signs, "Gone to the diggings, back when I'm rich." Nowhere was this paralysis more visible than in the harbor. The Cove of San Francisco became a maritime graveyard, a skeletal forest of abandoned masts. As word reached incoming vessels, sailors did not wait for their pay or for the cargo to be unloaded. They lowered themselves into the dark water or stole lifeboats, rowing frantically toward the shore. Captains, left alone on their quarterdecks with only the wind for company, eventually succumbed to the same madness, abandoning their commands to follow their crews. More than 500 ships lay rotting at anchor, their timbers bleached by the sun and their rigging frayed, as the very men who navigated the world's oceans chose the uncertainty of the mountain soil over the safety of the sea. This mass exodus was a profound sociological leveling. The social hierarchy of the city dissolved in the dust of the trail. The judge walked alongside the prisoner he had sentenced the day before. The physician shared a pack mule with the blacksmith, and the master served the servant. In the eyes of the gold fever, all men were reborn as equal competitors. This was the first true manifestation of the California dream, the radical golden belief that a man's future was no longer dictated by his past, but by the strength of his back and the luck of his pan. As the last inhabitants trudged toward the Sacramento Valley, San Francisco sat as a hollow shell, waiting to be reborn as the flamboyant, chaotic metropolis of the 49ers. 4. Establishing the first mining camps in the Sacramento Valley. As the exodus from the coastal cities reached the Sierra Nevada foothills, the once silent majesty of the Sacramento Valley was shattered by the arrival of a raw, desperate human tide. These first adventurers did not build cities, they birthed the diggings, primitive, ephemeral encampments that clung to the riverbanks like barnacles to a ship's hull. Names like Mormon Island, Coloma, and Whiskey Bar began to appear on hand-drawn maps, marking spots where the earth had been found to be pregnant with yellow flakes. These were landscapes of mud and ambition, where the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, wet canvas, and the relentless metallic tang of the riverbed. The architecture of these first camps was a testament to the urgency of greed. Men lived in tattered linen tents that glowed like lanterns in the dark, or in shanties fashioned from pine boughs and mud. There was no permanence here, for gold is a restless landlord. If the pay dirt ran thin, 1,000 men would vanish overnight, leaving only charred fire pits and discarded boots behind. Life was reduced to a singular, rhythmic labor. From dawn until the purple shadows of the Sierras swallowed the light, the valley echoed with the slosh of the pan and the heavy thud of the pick. It was a world of wet diggings, where men stood knee-deep in the bone-chilling mountain runoff until their skin turned blue and their joints stiffened, all for the intoxicating sight of a few colors gleaming at the bottom of a tin bowl. This environment gave rise to the first frontier democracy. In the absence of judges, titles, or fences, the miners established a radical new law, the right of discovery. A claim was typically a square of land, often no larger than 15 feet, that a man could reasonably work. To hold it, he needed only to leave his tools upon it. A pickaxe left in the dirt was as sacred as a royal seal. To steal another man's dirt was the highest treason, often punished by a swift trial under a hanging tree or a brutal ear cropping. In this mud-streaked meritocracy, the velvet coat of the lawyer and the rough hide of the trapper were both stained by the same red clay. However, the Sacramento Valley was not merely a place of labor, it was a laboratory of human endurance. Provisions were scarce and sold at bolden prices. A slice of salt pork or a handful of flour cost more than a day's wages in New York. Yet the atmosphere was charged with an electric, feverish optimism. Every man believed that the next shovelful of gravel held the big bonanza. The camps were the front lines of a new kind of war, a war against the earth itself. As the summer of 1848 burned on, the Sacramento Valley became a scarred landscape of diverted streams and upturned boulders, a shimmering theater of toil where the modern American West was being forged in the silt and the sun. 5. Captain Sutter's role in the early governance of the mines. The most poignant tragedy of the 1848 discovery was the slow, agonizing ruin of Captain John Sutter. The man who had once been the undisputed emperor of the Sacramento, ruling over a vast feudal domain of wheat fields, cattle, and workshops, found himself utterly powerless against the golden tide. As the news spread, his workforce did not merely resign, they vanished. His blacksmiths dropped their hammers, his millers left the grain to rot, and his vaqueros abandoned his herds. Sutter's fort, once a symbol of pioneering order, was besieged by thousands of squatters, who slaughtered his cattle for food and tore down his fences for firewood. To the newcomers, Sutter's legal titles were nothing more than old-world ghosts that had no place in the new democracy of the shovel. In the early months of the rush, governance was a phantom concept. The distant government in Washington, D.C. was barely aware of the scale of the find, and the military governor in Monterey had too few soldiers to maintain even a semblance of law. Into this vacuum stepped the alcalde system, a carryover from the Spanish and Mexican era. The alcalde was a singular figure who acted as mayor, judge, and executioner all at once. In the mining camps, these officials were often elected on the spot, chosen for their perceived fairness or their physical intimidation. Justice was swift, public, and brutal. There were no jails in the wilderness. Punishment was delivered in the form of lashes, the branding iron, or the noose of the oak tree. However, beneath this surface of violence, a sophisticated miner's law began to crystallize. Since the land was technically public domain of the United States, but no federal mining laws yet existed, the miners created their own. They formed miners' committees to resolve disputes over encroachment or claim jumping. These committees established the precedent that labor creates ownership. If a man stopped working his claim for more than a few days, it was considered abandoned and open to the next seeker. It was a system of harsh, utilitarian equity that allowed thousands of armed men to work side by side with surprisingly little large-scale bloodshed. For Sutter, however, there was no justice. He attempted to charge ground rent to the miners working on his land, but he was laughed to scorn. He tried to run a store to recoup his losses, but his clerks stole the profits and fled to the diggings. By the end of 1848, the man who had provided the stage for the world's greatest drama was a bankrupt spectator in his own theater. The early governance of the mines proved that in the presence of gold, traditional authority dissolves. The only law that survived the winter of 1848 was the law of the pan, that wealth belonged to the man who could extract it from the earth, irregardless of whose name was written on a distant, dusty land grant.